So we are live. Thank you for coming. This is the first attempt at what I'm going to call the Whisky and Weaponry podcast.
May as well start off by asking what you're drinking then.
Yes, I am drinking, I can't remember the exact name, which one it is, but it's the blue bottle you get from Aldi. And I've nearly finished it. That's why I'm having it.
Glenmarnock.
Yes,
Highland.
one of those. Okay. Probably. I think I have two of them.
I have a Benrick 12-year-old triple maturation cherry cask, which is
a bit more upmarket.
Yeah, a little bit.
I think at most mine was 17 quid. At best 12.
Being a little bit more professional then, what's the first topic you'd like to go into?
Ooh, yes. How about we talk about that video that I sent around and is linked in the description?
Yeah, I had a good time listening to that.
Yeah.
Missing the ability to go to the RAAS presentations. For those who aren't aware, Royal Aeronautical Engineering Society and student engineers get free membership access. You can attend the talks that they put on if you can get yourself there wherever they are in the country. Usually get a lot of senior industry members, retired engineers with a lot of experience. It's very good for networking and also just learning about past or present or future projects and getting some more insight.
And recently with the whole COVID thing, a lot of them they've just put online, just straight up for anyone to watch.
Yeah, I should add that. You don't need to be a member in order to watch the online ones. They are free and available for anyone.
Yes, they're basically the Aerospace Engineers Guild.
Well, British and Commonwealth.
Yes, in the UK at least. Because he had quite a, well, not really radical, but interesting suggestion of we spend so many millions trying to keep a decrepit aircraft that we've hope will last several decades alive and functional,
because they
don't moderately functional.
Having to design aircraft very often.
Yeah, and not only that,
and then because they don't design new ones very often, there could be no room for mistakes in designing the new ones,
which increases the cost of designing a new one.
Yeah, it leaves the industry non-creative and crippled with anxiety that they might spend money that goes to waste on a project that doesn't come to an end, like we saw in the 50s and 60s when so many projects did not make it into service, all those prototypes, all those hours, because back then a program was started, a team of engineers was put on it, and they would build and test physically. Even fairly radical ideas got actually built, and then the more radical ones didn't. But by today's standards, what was deemed radical was a little different. So that's why all the most interesting experiments are from that era, really, because they were experimenting and building and testing at a really rapid pace that we just don't see anymore. It's like one program every 20 years.
Yeah, you compare the cost of one program to the cost of all combined programs back then, and it's huge.
Someone, a think tank, did basically they compared the cost of programs of US military aircraft over the last 50 years, and it's an exponential. It's the rate of increase. They basically said unless there is a change in how we design and build aircraft, by the year, I think they said by the year like 2050, the US Air Force will be able to afford one plane.
Yes.
And it's because if you look at how close together the programs are as well, the programs are getting further apart in terms of time. They take longer and they cost more. So
and the quantity of output goes down as well.
So the US Air Force, even though it wasn't designed for them originally, it was originally Navy. Let's start. Okay, they went Century Series. So that's for those who don't know, F100 Super Sabre, F101, F102. That's the Voodoo and the Delta Dagger or Dart. I always get them mixed up. F104, F105, and F106. That's what's referred to as the Century Series. And with the exception of the F106, they were kind of all disasters, but they learned a lot from them. And then the F4 Phantom comes, And that was a very successful design. But then you look at the length of time between the programs after that, after the Phantom, and then you get F-15 and F-16, which are very close together after the Phantom. And then you have the F-18 was a spin-off of a failed competitor for the F-16. So you go 15, 16, 18, pretty close together in terms of years.
And then
After that, yeah, and they're all still in service, despite the fact these are all 70s aircraft. So they're now basically 50 years old by design. And then after that, what do you have? Huge gap. And then you have F-22, which by design was 90s, by service entry was 2000s. But from the start of the program to the first aircraft delivered, it took 15 years for the Raptor. And in fact, that program was floated in the 80s, the early 80s. So about 25 years before they had a plane in service, compared with programs before where you could be expecting to see a new fighter roughly every 10 years. I forgot to add the F-14 Tomcat into this. So they basically went F4, F-14, F-15, F-16, F-18. And these were, you could roughly see these as arriving every 10 years, but they gradually got further and further apart. And then it was 25 for the Raptor, which cost $400 billion. Sorry, it was correct. $80 billion for the Raptor program. And then the F-35 program, after that, has taken 20 years from prototyping to what you could agree is proper service introduction. And that has cost $400 billion for just the procurement. That's not including sustainment. So you've got the price increase over the previous aircraft has gone up 5 times just for procurement and design development. And the timescale of the program has gone up again. And now we're discussing that designs for the next generation of fighters,
the Tempest and stuff.
It could be 25, 30, sometimes 35 years from program start to seeing anything relevant in coming into service. And if you look at the cost increases, you look at what used to be considered expensive, even adjusted for inflation, we're talking sort of like $20 billion for a program. And even in today's money, about $20 billion. And then you go to 80, and then you go to 400, and with sustainment, 1.5 trillion. And then you think, okay, what's the next generation going to cost? And how much pressure is there to do it right? Because as we saw the F-35, a lot of the cost was because there was no alternative. There was no way that America and all of her allies involved on the program could just say, this isn't going the direction we want. Let's stop. Let's try something else. No, you gave it a good try, but this isn't working out. Let's do a different aircraft. At no point was that an option.
It's also one of those things that whenever you make a design change or the client makes a specification change, the costs rise a huge amount. This is just sort of an industry thing, especially when doing contracts.
Yeah, so that's why,
if you send an initial specification, you get that right, you sign the contract, what you ask for, you will get. You will only have to pay what you've initially asked for. And even if the contractor has a load of complications, that's at their end to sort out, not yours. But if you complicate it for the contractor, you go, you know what, we'll move the door from this end to that end of the factory. They then go, that'll be however many million extra, thank you.
I'd say that's a bit more of an issue with Typhoon. Typhoon's a plane that was developed during a time when its mission disappeared. And so you can see throughout the life cycle of Typhoon and all the European nations involved in it, that the design of the plane and the specifications on the engineers that they had to accomplish kept changing. Before the plane ever flew, it had to change what it was supposed to do several times because the original need, ceased to exist. And that probably explains why Typhoon has become the most expensive past generation aircraft in the world. The cost is pretty substantial for an aircraft that is still 4.5 gen. It's not a 5th generation aircraft. It's not a next gen aircraft. It is past gen technology, and in some ways, it's not even the best of it. It still lacks an E-scan radar, the likes of which cheaper aircraft have either been retrofitted with in the case of the Americans, or upgraded to in the case of the French, the Rafale. So it's actually lacking a number of technologies that competing aircraft that cost less have. And it seems like a lot of the cost
also
of the
can't be carrier launched.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the cost of the Typhoon was because of changes in requirements throughout its life. Speaking with chief engineer from BAE Systems, who was at the time in charge of their involvement on F-35, the Americans have been very tight with that program, making sure that people can't load on extra requirements to them. It's basically the case that the issue of F-35 was that the original requirement was garbage.
Yes.
And
you want something that could do everything.
Basically, yes. And the original requirement was okay. I wouldn't say garbage. I could say naive. The original requirement
optimistic
was naive and looked really good to politicians. And the engineering reality was it was a dream. And so all the changes in that program that cost so much money, all those changes were actually industry-led, not specification and customer-led. It wasn't the Air Force and the politicians and the DoD changing what they wanted. It was the industry telling them, this is not possible.
Best we can do.
This is not, simply, it's not possible. They could not get the performance and the specification requirements for the 3 different versions, the Air Force, the Marines, and the carrier version for the Navy. They could not get them all to provide the same, the required performance while they remained the same plane. So they ended up going from a predicted 60 to 70% compatibility of parts to about 20. And apparently most of that is software, in that they had to change it from one plane in 3 versions to 3 different planes with no parts crossing over between any of them. Even the engines are slightly different. There's Pratt & Whitney has different specifications for the engines for each of the 3 versions. You could not just take the engine out of an F-35A and put it in an F-35C, for example. So it might be under one name, but it has now very much become free aircraft. And that's a large part of the cost increase was all the redesigns required around 2006 to 2010. A lot of the changes were happening, and that was not down to the customer. That was entirely industry to meet the original requirements.
I am spotting a theme here. When the specification is ambitious or vague, you end up getting 3 aircraft.
Yeah, I think it must have looked amazing to politicians at the time that when they get that, someone floats this idea that they can produce one aircraft in 3 slightly different variants that can fill in every role, and because they'll make so many with so much standardization, it will cost them almost nothing and per aircraft. They were predicting $40 million per aircraft.
Yeah, it's like, just give us far more than normal to initially procure and design it, but once we've got it running, it'll be cheap as chips, don't worry.
I mean, thankfully, the cost of the per aircraft is actually reasonable for the capability now, but it's definitely not 40 million. I think the cheapest they are now is about 78 million for the cheapest version, which is good. That's very competitive on the market, but it's
within the right order of magnitude.
Yes. So if you were doing an engineering estimate, you would be looking at that and going, "Oh, it looks about right." Yeah. There's no extra zeros on that.
It's got the right number of digits. We're fine. Maybe the wrong end of that magnitude, but it's still in the right.
In terms of customers changing their spec and getting in the way of the industry, I suppose the biggest example of that in the F-35 program was probably our government, to be honest.
Yes, our government with the flopping carriers.
Yeah, they start off with, oh yes, we're going to have short takeoff, vertical landing F-35Bs because we're going from Harrier to that, and it's what we're comfortable with doing, and because we make more of that version of the plane, so it's better for our industry. And then at some point, I think it was 2008. 2008, the government decided that, oh yes, you know what? We're going to give the carriers more capability. We're going to put these new electromagnetic catapults on them, and we're going to move to the C model of the jet, the US Navy version. And then, so the majority American-led program has to then change what the British are going to be receiving. They had to do all of the weapons studies for the weapon bays again, because the C model has a different weapons bay. And they had to start doing tests to make sure that our carrier equipment, our proposed systems on the Queen Elizabeth class carriers would work with the jet. And I remember it being in the news that they didn't. They tried to test our arresting equipment with the jet, and they failed to trap a single time.
Oops.
And then we changed our minds again 2 years later, and we went back to the decision we've now stuck with, and we went back to the B version of the jet. And then they had to go and do the weapons feasibility studies all over again, and they had to go back to building the ramp equipment for takeoff testing in the United States. So they basically flip-flop back and forth between two different versions.
So you can't use a ramp and a catapult?
No, you cannot use a ramp and a catapult.
This feels like a missed opportunity.
This sounds like an engineering mechanical nightmare.
Yeah, it will break your front nose wheel.
The way the catapults work is that once they get to the front of their travel, they drop away through the deck, essentially to release the jet's landing gear. So a lot of carriers with catapults, you'll see that there are protrusions that actually go off the end of the flight deck to give the catapult a little bit more travel. And you'll also see that, okay, you might also want to consider quite how much force is going through these catapults, and that
the acceleration is ridiculous.
If you were to change the catapult to go to change angle near the end of its run, I think that's a lot more that's going to be potentially breaking, and catapults do break down quite often.
Yes,
there's a lot of maintenance requirement, especially on the old steam ones. I really don't think adding a ramp into the equation is a good idea. Certainly, the French looked at it. The Charles de Gaulle has catapults, but the Rafale for the French Navy does not use a ramp. It has a hydraulically sprung nose gear. It does the same thing as a ramp. Essentially, it kicks the nose of the jet into the air, but it does it just as the catapult releases. So I think that the French, I haven't looked at the design study, but I'm pretty sure the French must have considered a ramp at some point.
So the sort of catapult dolly sort of kicks the nose up to give it a higher angle of attack at the last minute, and then
it's more. I think the catapult, I believe, keeps the nose gear compressed, like it's like a sprung spring, but I think it's hydraulic, and or hydropneumatic. And then once the catapult releases, it's like a pogo stick. It kicks the nose of the jet into the air, so you get a higher angle of attack just as you come off the deck, kind of equivalent to using a ramp, but with a flat deck.
Yes, sounds
which is good because the Charles de Gaulle is not the biggest carrier, and the Rafale is
their version of the Eurofighter.
It's a delta wing, so it kind of likes angle of attack. Otherwise, otherwise you will struggle a little bit to produce adequate lift with weapons load.
Yeah.
But yeah, nice bit of engineering, unique engineering for the French.
The Gripen, the Rafale, and the Eurofighter were all originally going to be the same aircraft, and then the French and the Swedish went, "We'll go our own way."
Yeah, I think the Swedes were in a good position to. They had very unique needs. Typhoon ended up being an aircraft that needs pampering and nice quality fields to operate from, whereas the Swedes have always had their idea of nuclear war, national defense. We need to keep these things in caves and motorway tunnels and then fly them from 800-yard strips of road. So the Swedes always have their very interesting low manpower, low resources requirement that doesn't really sit well with other countries that want higher capability. Which is ironic because I believe the last Swedish fighter, the Viggen, was actually probably the most capable fighter in NATO for a few years when it arrived. But then the French tried to take full control of the Typhoon program early on because they believed that they were in the best position to run it, which they probably were given Dassault's experience with the Mirage series and the fact that it was a similar aerodynamic configuration to what they were used to. So again, they felt that they were in a good position to lead the program. But it did leave a sour taste with other participants when you have such strong control being striven for by one country in a large multinational program. And obviously the French wanted to throw in the carrier requirement that nobody else wanted. So it wasn't turning into a very nice situation. So that's why they had to go their own way.
You can argue that in an era of limited budget sort of not so much budget constraints, but the sheer cost is naturally restraining on the budget. That having the same aircraft that does your frontline fighter, the modern day version of a Spitfire, also being your carrier aircraft, does sound quite inviting.
Yeah. You'll notice, by the way, that the French had to make significant modifications between the Rafale versions to have land and carrier-based versions. But I will say that France's decision to leave the Typhoon program worked out pretty well for them. They preserved national industry. They got an aircraft that was a lot more suited to what they wanted. It costs a lot less than Typhoon. It's about 20 million euros cheaper per jet. It's done reasonably well on export. Certainly, you could say that at the moment it's an inviting prospect to a lot of countries, more than Typhoon is because of the cost, and also because France has been able to upgrade it faster. Typhoon has always been a few years. In fact, it's currently about 12 years behind in terms of upgrade programs. The French get whatever the hot toy is, the French have managed to get the new hot toy onto Rafale generally quicker than the Typhoon has been able to receive them. So an example of that would be the radar. The French put an E-scan and EASA radar on the Rafale in 2008, and Typhoon technically is offering it for export, but no one operated Typhoon has Captor E on the jet yet.
Because the Typhoon is famously unstable and reliant on its control system, its computer.
Yeah.
Which means
to add new things can upset the stability.
Yes, you have to check that your software update is updated correctly.
Yeah, which is I think it's interesting to note that one of the big selling features of the new Gripen version, the E, is that the software is modular. They have separate parts for weapons and flight control and sensors, and they can reconfigure without affecting the other parts of the architecture. They can change for national requirements.
So if the weapons computer crashes, you can still fly the plane.
I think you're more likely to see total failure as opposed to one individual part of it. But certainly in terms of the software, it's modular. They're also, strange enough, offering people who buy Gripen E the choice of any weapon suite from American to European to Russian and Israeli. And I do wonder why you would, when given the offer of all of those options, go with some of them. I'm not going to like throw any specifics out there for that, but I think that when you have the choice of all of those sellers of air-to-air and air-to-ground ordnance, there are some obvious ones that you would probably rather go. I'll go into this. Actually, I'm going to go into this. Unless you're on America's satellite networks, there is no point in going with American weaponry, obviously. And even if you're on Russian satellite networks, if you're on GLONASS instead of GPS,
with anyone else.
I'm sorry if you're on GLONASS, because so far combat evidence of Russian GPS-guided munitions and their radial accuracy in Syria has shown that GLONASS is about 3 times less accurate than GPS. So there's that, and Russian missiles, R-77s specifically, depending from most likely sources, R-77 missiles failed to shoot down old F-16 versions in Pakistani service during that Indian border clash last year. And now India is requesting Israeli missiles for their fleet because the Russian ones did not do
Even
the job.
Saudis are buying Israeli weapons.
So I say American weapons are a bit cheaper because they're mass produced, but you need American satellite networks in order to make full use of them. Russian weapons are not bathing themselves in glory lately. Israeli weapons tend to work very well. European ones, it's kind of a similar story. A lot of the French missiles are actually very, very popular on export. Especially the French infrared homing weapons are very popular. So I think, honestly, if you're buying Gripen, I would be looking towards getting particular countries' ordnance on board and not others.
Well, in the unlikely event we ever got popular, I can see the conspiracy theories about which firm you work for.
It depends who you ask. Some people are convinced that I must have some kind of money invested in Lockheed, half the stuff I go on about, and then here I am supporting the French and Israeli missiles over the Raytheon or Lockheed offerings.
Well, let's just say applying to an Israeli defense firm for their graduate scheme in the UK is awkward if you don't understand Hebrew. Their website is almost entirely in Hebrew once you click apply.
There's kind of a little bit of gatekeeping going on there, I feel.
Yeah, but thankfully Google Translate's a thing. But I didn't get the job.
Yeah. Would they not have similar policies to UK weapons, missile-related companies?
Well, it was a position in the UK.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't like Israeli citizenship requirement.
No, that was for the other positions. This was for like the UK office doing stuff. So, do you have any criticisms about that YouTube talk thing?
Criticisms of what he said. There were a couple of things where I think he was slightly inaccurate, but it wasn't criticism of like his opinions. It was like just historical context. I think he discussed the F4 Phantom as being designed from the onset as a multi-role when it really wasn't. It was one of those engineering accidents where a design is brilliant at doing a lot of different things that it wasn't intended for. As far as I'm aware, historically, the F4 was designed specifically for carrier defense from Russian bombers, hence why it was large and had almost no visibility from the rear cockpit. In fact, there were no controls. The Navy version had no controls for the backseater because he was just the radar systems operator. Although they now call them the WESO, the weapon system operator. So whereas the Air Force insisted on putting up controls for the backseater for dogfighting and flight of the aircraft, which he had no visibility. There's literally no forward or aft visibility from the rear position in a Phantom. If you look at the canopy for the backseater, it's completely flush.
Only. Well, it's useful.
It's totally flush with the airframe.
It would make instrument-only flight training easier.
Yeah, but you can't see forwards either. It has no forward or rear visibility. You can see out the side only. Okay, yeah, but that doesn't help unless your runway happens to be at exactly the right altitude or your instruments are very precise.
For once, you stick the instructor in the front, the student in the back, and you go, right, this is your time for instrument only. And you don't need to do anything. You don't need like the instructor sticking a map at the front of the cockpit and go, haha, you can't see out the window now.
Yeah, as far as my historical knowledge goes, the Phantom was designed specifically to get chucked off a carrier deck, burned to high speed and altitude as quickly as possible, and fire very long range missiles, or what was then considered a very long range missile at an oncoming Russian bomber. And then it evolved from there, which is one of the reasons why it had no gun originally.
One of the things I find funny is when it was realized that the Vulcan, because the Vulcan when it first came out was its ceiling that it could operate at was pretty high. The only thing that was higher than it was the U2.
Oh, you mean the Abra Vulcan? Oh, okay, because I was just talking about the gun on the Phantom. I thought the Vulcan cannon, which is okay.
Yes, was they realized that it couldn't have a gravity falling bomb anymore because it was now obsolete.
Well, they did start out with
It did, yes.
and in fact, its only combat use ever was gravity falling conventional ordnance.
That is true. And it was designed by the same guy who designed the Lancaster.
Pretty good career.
Same firm, yeah. Which shows you quite how much slower aircraft development's become. That you could have the same guy designing an aircraft and then designing its replacement.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you want to talk about development speed, the most interesting question I've been asked on my blog for aerospace and military topics is that someone asked me how I would explain to either a World War II photo reconnaissance pilot or a World War I balloon observer, how I would explain to them what an SR-71 Blackbird is. So I had to choose the easier of those two. I had to go with the World War II observer. Or photo reconnaissance, not observer, World War II photo reconnaissance pilot, because at least they are more familiar with fixed wing flight and the limitations of it. So I don't have to explain what an aeroplane is. So I thought about this, and World War II photo reconnaissance, you're talking either flying very low and fast or high and fast with some of the very first pressurized planes. But most of it happened at low altitude, so you could get in underneath the radar and take your pictures. Yeah, they used to use Spitfires for this, and they used Mosquitoes as well.
Painted bright blue.
Planes that could get in quickly under the German radar, take photos at low level of like small features, troop build-ups, camps, bunkers, tanks, staging posts, whatever. Take those pictures quickly and get out before the enemy could get fighters up to stop you. And if they were doing it at altitude, the most advanced thing going right then for them would have been, wow, we have a pressurized cockpit. So, like the fact that you could have a pressurized cockpit in 1940, whatever it is, depends what time of the war, was just revolutionary back then. And that was basically the two ways you did photo reconnaissance. And bear in mind, the camera was on the side of the plane. You'd have to angle the plane and take a picture.
Yes, but
you couldn't really...
with enough prior planning and precision flying, taking the photos at the right point, they could actually get 3D images.
Yeah, but you're doing this at around 500, 600, maybe 650 kilometers per hour, depending on which plane you're in. And altitude is, even for the pressurized versions, your altitude, you're looking at around 35,000 feet tops. So I know I've just gone from I've just gone from metric to imperial. Okay, you're looking at about 10. You're looking at about 10,000 meters in altitude tops for the pressurized aircraft, and about 650 kilometers per hour top speed. And then I had to propose how to explain to them what the Blackbird was and why it was that way. And this is a plane that is flying 5 times that fast. This is the plane that's going 3,500 kilometers per hour or more, and it's doing it at 85 to 90,000 feet, which is just incomprehensible to someone only 20 years earlier. Because the Blackbird flew in, was it 1968? I think the Blackbird first flew. I'm going to have to look that one up.
Yeah.
I'm not going to look up Blackbird. I'll look up the A12.
A12.
Yeah.
Because that was the version that inspired Elon Musk.
Oh, even 1962. So, yeah, it's 20 years. 20 years later on. And I figured the only way to really explain this is you have to explain the problem. So you have to explain what an air-to-air missile or surface-to-air missile is.
Well, it's a V2 pointed at the sky.
Yeah, basically. I did it as a Fritz X German guided bomb, but in reverse. So instead of someone radio controlling a bomb to the surface, it's a computer radio controlling essentially a missile to come up to you. And once you can explain the problem of why planes are dying so easily at altitude and why flying low is not an option, because if you were to fly that low to avoid the radars and the missiles, you wouldn't be getting any pictures of much. then you could comprehend the engineering insanity that became the SR-71. But honestly, I think it would have blown their mind to imagine what could have been done in 20 years.
Well, you think that, and then you think, what on earth have we done since?
Satellites, my dear boy.
I know, but like, well, I guess satellites have made it slightly obsolete, the requirement for reconnaissance aircraft.
Well, yes and no. Satellites have predictable times when they go overhead, and the image quality is nowhere near as good. Because
we haven't done something radical like made a bomber variant of the SR-72.
71.
71, sorry.
The 72 is planned to have ordnance. If you don't know, the SR-72 is a US program that was approved in 2013 under Obama after Lockheed basically said that they had been using internal funds to develop a concept for a unmanned twin-engine Mach 5 to Mach 6 capable hypersonic high-altitude vehicle for reconnaissance, like the Blackbird, but also with a weapons carriage. They haven't said which kind of weapons carriage. We can only speculate, but that was one of the original design specifications, that it would have a weapons bay, and it was approved, and they were given funding to develop it, and they've been talking about bits about the program on and off ever since then. About the proposal to fly a prototype, a single-engine manned prototype, that is, sometime fairly soon from now, they're saying. And they want it to be in service by the full version in service by about 2030. So we are going to actually see not just a capability replacement for the Blackbird, but also a capability increase. It's about twice as fast and it flies about 60% higher than the Blackbird could, which is a substantial improvement. But then you also think it's been 50 years.
Yes. I mean, we've invented CAD now.
Lockheed did say that advances in computing were the only way they could design the intake system for the SR-72. Apparently, the fluid dynamic problems involved were not solvable until recently, which is one of the things they said that was holding them back.
The fact that we cannot have a complete solution to the Navier-Stokes equation.
Yeah, now try to apply that to hypersonic speeds, and the fact that they have to keep combustion going at supersonic speeds in the engines. Really, a scramjet engine has never been attempted at this scale before. We've always had small scale scramjets on the size of missiles.
Well, in many ways, in aerospace, the rocket science is the easy bit.
Indeed. It's going to be definitely impressive when they get that program into service. Just to have a conventional takeoff and landing, non-rocket powered hypersonic vehicle. Because I believe right now the Chinese actually have a hypersonic reconnaissance drone that they showed off recently, which essentially amounts to a one-way rocket that will go. Once it burns, it will fly hypersonic and it will take photos, but it will have to either jettison them or transmit. I cannot remember which. I think the plan is that it jettisons its contents, like there was actually a drone that the Blackbird used to carry. Ironically enough, the drone was designed for flying over China for reconnaissance purposes.
That might be why they have it.
Maybe got some correlation, because some did actually crash in China. But the idea was that the drone would fly over, and once it had done its run, it would jettison the actual physical film photography in the ocean, and the US Navy would pick it up. So I think that's similar to what the Chinese are planning.
Early film the Russians used. I can't remember whether it was just standard satellites or early spy satellites. Was actually the same film that was accidentally dropped by the Americans when they were sending spy high-altitude weather balloons over Russia.
Yes, I saw that. Because the film was better than what Russia had, so they literally used it without... They didn't make their own, they just used the American one.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, I'm not too surprised because...
oh, yeah, you're not. But
are you aware of the Tu-4 bomber? Bless me. The Tu-4 was the Soviet Union's first nuclear bomber, and what it actually was
a weird copy of the B-17. No,
B-29.
B-29.
The US B-29 crew with engine trouble, I believe, had to land on the far eastern tip of Russia after a mission over Japan because they couldn't turn for home. And the Russians politely sent the crew on their way back to the Americans, but kept the plane. And when the Russians decided to copy the B-29 to become the Tu-4, the only things they changed were the engines to Russian-made ones, which were inferior, and they changed the defensive armament to Russian cannons instead of 50 cal machine guns. And the whole plane weighed a little bit more as well because of quality of alloys. But when the Americans found some Tu-4s, one of the first things they noticed was that every Tu-4 had this weird panel welded onto one of the pressure bulkheads for no reason. And it turned out that that panel was actually a repair job done on the American aircraft to fix something. And the Russians had copied the repair job, even though it had no purpose whatsoever on a brand new aircraft. And they did it on every Tu-4. Which is interesting to say the least, because the Russians have some very talented engineers, so I have no idea how it didn't cross their mind that this was not an intentional part of the design of the B-29.
I heard it was incredibly frustrating for the design team to work on, because they'd go, well, can't we just change it to our standard nuts? And so we would, you know how we were talking at the start about design specs changing. Apparently, throughout the development of the Tu-4, it kept changing between a literal carbon copy and we'll put our equivalent
Russian spec
components on.
Yeah, clearly capitalist nuts and bolts superior, so must be directly copied. I mean, they did the same thing with air-to-air missiles.
There's something to do with the bomb bay.
When the Sidewinder missile first appeared, the early versions of the AIM-9, the Russians literally had a KGB operative in a US airbase, and he stole a Sidewinder on a wheelbarrow and took it out of the airbase and put it in the back of the car. And the car wasn't big enough for the missile, so he basically broke the glass at the back of the car and had a missile sticking out the back, and then he drove off with it. And the Americans did not stop this happening, and he somehow got this thing back to Russia. And the Russian, the first Russian heat-seeking air-to-air missile was essentially a carbon copy of the Sidewinder, the AIM-9B. I'm trying. Was it the A9 Alamo? I think it was called. Was the Russian one? I might be wrong on that.
I say that. How did he get away with it with a missile sticking out the back of his window? But
because I think his cover was that he was working at the airbase.
Yeah, but then I remembered someone once stole a boat from the sailing club.
It's the R-27, and it's known as the AA-10 Alamo to NATO.
So, I think.
Oh wait, no, that's it. No, wrong one. That's the modern missile. I am totally wrong.
A few decades out.
Yeah, I'm a few decades out. That's a radar-guided long-range air-to-air missile.
Because one of the funny things about the Vulcan is it initially started off with looking what would be reasonably high-tech today. Certainly would get plenty of design goodie points for sort of student design projects. Of instead of having a central tail, it had two tails that would double up as winglets on the wingtips, and it was a flying wing.
That's quite interestingly enough. That's very similar to one of the German-America bomber plans for.
And then it slowly changed to not being a flying wing, but having the wing tip tail, and then it became a conventional aircraft. But
you say conventional. It's got a huge pure delta wing on the early ones, and then they went to a kinked and drooped delta on the later ones.
Yes. And one of the interesting things is some of the design changes on the wing they realized they needed to do, but after a certain amount of testing, but they'd already started manufacturing of a prototype. So the prototypes had the older wing design, despite the fact they realized they had to change the design to something else.
I found the name AA2 Atoll, or K13 Vimple. and it is quite literally a reverse-engineered AIM-9B Sidewinder.
Well, you are able to screen share if you desire. If you want to show images of it.
I was just Wikipedia searching the name.
Just the goggle footage or Wikipedia.
Yeah, it's unfortunate mix-up between some of the NATO reporting names for the Russian missiles, but we got there in the end.
Because it makes you realise how fast the lightning was, that the nuclear missile that was launched from the Vulcan had the same top speed. They both did Mach 2.
To be completely fair,
but the missile was pointing upwards a bit when it was doing Mach 2.
Yeah, to be completely fair, missiles do not necessarily have to be fast. It's role dependent. Like cruise missiles are subsonic.
Yeah,
they just fly very low and in evasive manners, and then
just cruise along.
Yeah, pretty much. Obviously, depending on role, you might want a much faster missile, an air-to-air missile, for example. If it's a beyond visual range air-to-air missile, the faster it is, the better.
But then the harder to turn.
Like I said, beyond visual range missiles, you want them to be as fast as possible, because agility goes completely once the rocket motor burns out anyway, which is about a third to a half the way into the flight if you're firing them at a good range. So you don't really want to be doing maneuvers because it loses your speed anyway. You just want to be coming fast so they don't react in time. So, it's the close range missiles where you want it to be fast enough they can't run away from it, but not too fast, because otherwise, like you said, you lose maneuverability.
Talking about the sort of more direct weaponsy stuff, but it's not that current. So why don't we change subject to a bit of ranting about the government's COVID strategy?
A little bit of a jump.
Well, why not? It's a bit current.
Yeah, okay.
So have you heard about the suggested idea? They're not causing it to be policy, but you know what the media is like. Any thought a minister has seems to get leaked to the media, and they start chatting about it for a week, and then they announce it the next week to be enacted the week after that. But there is one suggestion that if we go into a second lockdown, the over 50s will be treated the way the over 70s have done this time.
You mean they put all the over 50s into protection?
Well, yes, they stick all the over 50s in house arrest.
That's interesting, because
well,
not...
you look at most industries, and a lot of the senior management are either approaching or in their 50s.
This doesn't seem particularly sensible or evidence-based, to be honest.
It really doesn't, and I really hope
they're not at any particularly great increase in risk, personally.
No, and it is one of those things that you hear on the grapevine, and you really hope isn't true.
They're medically not an enormously aggravated risk as much as the particularly elderly are. They're not super spreaders like children are. Like, for example, unless they're going to shut all the schools again, which I don't think they will, that's completely scientifically thought out. It doesn't make sense.
I've been glad that the government has been quite good at releasing the COVID data.
Well, you have to be like any data, you have to know how to read it.
Yes.
Like, for example,
it is relatively raw.
Now, I'm not going to say the UK has been managing COVID particularly well, but for example, our mortality figures seem to be horrendous until you realise that throughout the majority of the height of the pandemic in the UK, they weren't actually testing the population unless you came to hospital, and you only came to hospital. Said you should only come to hospital if you were having trouble breathing to the extent that you were quite literally dying.
Yes,
so that meant that only serious patients were actually being tested on arrival to hospital. So that meant basically our testing figures were probably only 10% of the people who had COVID. And within the ones who did get tested and confirmed to have it, those were the ones having a severe reaction. So, of course, the mortality figures were really, really high.
Well, it's not like that, because we didn't have an
we
idea
were
of
only
who
testing
had it.
people who were literally dying already.
Yes, and because we didn't know who had it, we weren't telling them to stay home. We didn't know how. We weren't sending them medical stuff to stay alive if things deteriorate.
For example, I've seen us compared with countries. I've seen data comparing us with countries on mortality rate, but they're comparing us with countries that had accurate widespread testing earlier on, which the UK, to its failure, did not have. So it's that comparison is, it's both good and bad. It shows that the UK wasn't testing enough, which is a valid criticism, but it's also making out that we have a worse functioning health system with a higher mortality rate, despite the fact that the data is not being gathered in the same way.
Well, it's also, whenever there's been doubt regarding what killed someone, they seem to have just gone, right, any doubt, it was COVID.
No, the opposite. There was a while where the government were giving the autopsy figures. So they were saying 40,000 deaths from COVID in the UK, while they were saying if you include the above average predicted deaths for this time of year, it's probably close to 60,000 COVID deaths. And I remember that at the time. They weren't actually attributing them all to COVID. Most of the figures you're seeing are either old figures, because it takes time to do autopsies to say this is what they died of. So there is a delay because of that. And then the other thing is they do, for unknowns, like deaths that happened at home, they don't put them down to COVID. Not in the official figures. Even if it's really likely that they were, they don't put it down to that.
If you look at our excess deaths, and then you look at our COVID deaths,
I really hate the term excess deaths.
I know. If you look at our average number of deaths per year,
there's a certain number of deaths we want.
Well, if you average out throughout the year, between years, well, not throughout the year, if you look at each week throughout a year and you average those between all the years, let's say the last 20 years, you get your average death rate per week.
Yeah, I'd say deaths above predicted average is a much more reasonable way of saying it.
Yes, okay. Deaths above predicted average, then. We'll be nice and PC. We'll keep to your snowflake.
I'm not being PC on this one. It just sounds really horrible to people involved to say that excess deaths when this is honestly affecting a lot of people.
What would you call it if it was below excess deaths? No, not suboptimal. Anyway, and you compare it, us and Italy. The majority of our above average deaths, when we've been above average, we've attributed to COVID. But you look at places like Italy, where the media response and the footage and everything, it looked a lot worse, even though at some point it's, the UK has overtaken them in COVID deaths.
I mean, there's a couple of reasons. Italy has a more distributed population, and if you recall, they locked off a large region of the country very early. Yes. In terms of the curves, they did lock down a week earlier than us by the curve, but their lockdown was a lot stricter, like police enforcing people stay inside from the very beginning, they cut off a region of the country. Yes. That's all the bad footage, all the really horrible footage from inside their ICUs.
Trucks full of bodies.
Yeah, exactly. That was one quite small region, and they isolated it because it was the right thing to do.
Yes.
But they were a lot stricter on it than we were, which is why they are in a better position now. Not just because they started earlier, but because
it's something
they
like
were a lot harsher with their action.
It's something silly like 1.5 times the official COVID deaths for Italy is unattributed to COVID in amongst their excess deaths figure, above average deaths figures. Which does make me think they aren't quite counting enough people. Whereas for us, it's only like 30%. And interestingly, some medical departments at the NHS have had a significant drop in patients, such as, for whatever reason, premature babies. Because everyone's working from home, they're less stressed.
Oh, so it's actually improved health from some regards.
Yes.
If there's one positive to come out of this whole thing is that it's showed the world that like traditional office culture and 9 till 5 work routines and the commute is not necessary for the vast majority of our jobs.
No, but it also, if you're working from home here, why can't we just employ some Indian guy working from home there, or a Czech guy, or a Polish guy, or anyone else?
Interesting point.
Like, if you could work from here home, why can't you work overseas? If you can work overseas, why
don't tell the
can't we?
corporations that. It might take them a while to figure it out.
It's already been published in the Telegraph.
Oh,
The managers of the corporations have already read it.
damn. And there I was thinking that we might end up with a situation where more people can have more flexible working hours.
Well, it might happen, but it was phrased as the middle classes who haven't been nearly as badly hit than other people, such as the elderly and the people with more hands-on manufacturing jobs, or those with small businesses trying to flog stuff.
I suppose there is one difference here, which is that you can do an in-person interview and get the measure of somebody who's applying for a job and then allow them to do a certain number of days a week from home, but still have them be able to come in and do work at other times. Whereas you don't even know that the person that you're doing an interview with through grainy video footage from a distant country is actually even a real person. It could be absolutely anyone. They could deep fake themselves to look completely different, to have a different appearance. They could change their voice. And at the same time, they could fake qualifications. It's not the same thing as being able to vet a candidate for a job in person.
There is certainly a lot of practicality of having people do a significant amount of work in their own time at home and then coming together in a meeting to work out, right, what have we achieved? What do we do now? Which is how a lot of uni projects work.
Another thing I really hope they consider out of this is that just maybe consider that 4-day working week that's been doing really well in Japan, which has like the strictest work culture in the entire planet, and yet they found that reducing it to 4 days a week and then getting rid of one of the very, very stupid concepts that they have in the Japanese work environment, which is basically you're not allowed to leave your office or stop working until everybody else does. So it's considered really impolite. So if you finish your work, you're basically having to start work for the next day, long beyond the time when you should go home, essentially until everyone leaves. And it's done in terms of like levels of seniority. So you can't really leave until the boss leaves. So you end up with people working on, but bear in mind, this is not paid. This is not treated as paid overtime. This is considered to be like a social commitment. So you're just working long beyond what you should be without extra pay. Yes, they got rid of that and they took a day off the week. And what happened? Productivity went up.
Well, productivity is a funny thing because it's per hours worked.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, if you tell people they have a certain amount of work to get done,
yes,
if you give them more flexible working hours as opposed to longer but more rigid hours, the idea is that they're less stressed, they have more personal time, whatever, so that when they're actually in work hours, they focus more on the work and in a more productive way. They get more done faster because they're in a better mindset. And then the other thing is they have an extra day of the week to be free and do things like interact in the world, put money into the economy, spend time with family, etc. All things that generally pretty helpful to society.
There's quite a few tech firms that have adopted sort of either a Friday half day or a Friday follow your sort of, when you've got weird ideas for a project, but
yes,
you might be focused on it, but the boss thinks, you know what, that's silly, focus on this idea.
Yeah, I've seen this. There's particular games. There's like I think
people do their own thing on the Friday. And then
I know companies where they do that like once a month or once every fortnight. They have a day specifically where you get to propose and work on whatever you choose, and it doesn't have to have any relation to like your fixed work requirements. So you can just be creative.
And at the end, they compare notes and have cake.
Hey, and sometimes you get really good ideas that come out of it, and sometimes they make it actually into what the company's doing.
There's apparently something in Amazon where Bezos is quite concerned about when a firm gets big, the sort of ideas don't spread, it becomes sort of too corporatist. So Amazon have a policy where if someone suggests an idea in a meeting, or if something gets brought up to a board meeting of some sort at some level, as long as one senior guy agrees, it has to go up to the next level. So it's like a reverse veto.
So
as
basically, until you get to a point of total refusal by everybody in the room, it will continue up the chain.
Yes.
No, that's not bad.
So yeah, it's not so much proposals. You must do this. It's sort of this
kind of
is an
reminds me of
idea. Maybe
Dragon's
we
Den.
should.
Yes.
Reminds
me of Dragon's Den. Like
As
everyone
long as
can
one-
refuse it, other than one person that sees potential, and you'll still come out of the sale.
You just need one backer. Because the Eid lockdown, I'm not sure how much of it is incredibly insensitive or a sensible time to do it.
Remind me of the dates for Eid.
Like today. Basically, Ramadan's ended recently, and so there's a few days of celebrating, and there's the Prophet's birthday soon as well. And so lots of Muslim families would
How
be...
often does it change? Do the dates change? Because I remember being in Dubai on Eid, and it was
the
October.
Islamic calendar is a different length to the Gregorian calendar, so the whole calendar just shifts round.
Because I remember being in Dubai on Eid, and that was in October.
So the Islamic year is shorter, but because it started earlier, they're still in the Middle Ages.
Interesting. But how does that explain the several-month shift in Eid between when I was?
Because it's several days shorter. The year is several days shorter, and you were there several years ago.
Okay.
So it shifted. It's all based on the moon, and there's a different number of moon cycles in a year.
Okay, that's all you had to say. It's lunar calendar. That would have told me.
Yes. Well, I said it was a different length. It's shorter.
Okay, I thought you meant like by a couple of days or something, not like a couple of weeks that would be required to make that shift.
Let's just double check. How long is an Islamic year? $355 days. So it's
9 days shorter.
Yeah. Because there's
yeah, it works out. I think I was there in 2013, 2014. So
yeah. So you'd have a lot of Muslim families, and they can be quite large extended families, to make a generalization, and you'd have them all meeting, multi-generational, to celebrate, to oversimplify things, their version of Easter or Christmas. And there's been quite large spikes in areas of the country with significant Muslim populations, especially amongst the Muslim community, which has fueled the whole racist COVID stuff. Even though most of the data that they're using isn't measuring the number of cases and the number of deaths, but is comparing the number of deaths or cases to the nearly 10-year-old census statistics. And the share of the population has changed slightly since the 2011 census.
It's also interesting to note that one of the worst hit communities in the country is one of the ones that could be argued to be more of a traditional community with a lot more close relations between neighbours and occupants of like a particular region of a town or city, as opposed to the kind of decline in traditional community that you've seen in the UK over the last few decades. It had kind of the opposite thing with COVID, though, to be honest, is that there's been a lot more interaction and helping out and getting to know each other between neighbours since.
Superficially, I would expect the Muslim communities to do very well. I mean, you don't have to pressurize some of the more conservative women to wear a face mask, and they're meant to wash 5 times a day whenever they pray.
I don't think the washing one is particularly helpful. One, because you're associating it with praying, and obviously there was a requirement for mosques to shut.
To the mosque. You can pray on a mat at home.
It's still traditionally more of as much of a
yes. Lots of people go to the mosque.
And the other thing is, I'm pretty sure that the washing is as much ceremonial as anything in the UK.
It is because, everywhere.
We're not still living.
I mean, you're washing every
country where
you're washing your hands, feet, and face like 5 times.
And also, it's done with just water. I'm pretty sure you don't use soap.
No, it is soapy water.
Oh, you do have to use soap water, do you? Okay.
All right, you do in Dubai. If you don't have water, use sand.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think sand is going to be particularly helpful for killing COVID.
No.
But at least soap will.
Skin off.
So will do the job fine.
Being shoulder to shoulder in a mosque wouldn't be the best if you're trying to keep.
Most of them shut early before they were even told to, I believe, which set a pretty good example.
Yeah, the whole lack of testing at the beginning and now it's thoroughly disappointing and has done a huge harm to the nation.
It's
also if you physically couldn't procure enough tests because we weren't producing enough and everyone around the world wanted enough tests.
I don't think it's just procurement. There wasn't a single part of our reaction to it that seemed to be well managed or with a confident plan.
The only I can say, setting up the Nightingale hospitals early was a good idea.
Yeah,
even if it ended up being pointless. Because everything else finally started to work before they were needed.
Just some minor proposals for them when next time a pandemic comes rolling around.
Have enough PPE, equip doctors with CBRN kit.
Yeah, have enough PPE that you don't have to start contacting. Not just that. There was one that went viral, which was that a UK-based small medical fetish store was actually being asked by the government if they could buy off them their actual surgical grade equipment because they had like protective equipment, they had masks and scrubs because the NHS was so low on just like basic items like that at one point. And this company said, we're really, really small. We only had like a very limited stock and we just gave it to them.
Fair enough.
But that's the kind of level that they had to resort to asking in order to
make supermarkets increasing their prices illegal. Because then people might actually be able to buy pasta. Maybe it's a higher price, but at least there will be pasta on the shelves if you wanted it. Same with bog roll.
No, you just implement purchase limits. Just implement purchase limits. Don't change the prices because otherwise people that really need it, that can't afford it, go without. Purchase limits are important for 2 reasons. And this helps your economic point of view here as well. People panic and they overly stock up on things. As we saw with toilet paper, that people bought like 2-3 years supplies. It was worked out for no reason because of panic.
Where did it all go?
I don't know.
Who has this 2 years supply of bog roll?
But the important thing to note is that if they put purchase limits in place preventing that from happening, it couldn't. But who were actually the people that were buying everything? Well, it's usually wealthy middle class people that can afford to stockpile, because people who are on the breadline cannot stockpile. It's like one of the paradoxes of poverty is that you can't actually afford to buy stuff in bulk to make it cheaper, and you can't afford quality stuff that lasts longer. So the cost of living is actually more expensive if you're poor, generally speaking. But the same thing with stockpiling. If you're worried about people not being able to buy something because someone else has gone out and bought everything,
you can just a little bit of planning mitigate a lot of it. But you of course need a functional fridge and everything else.
The price hikes mean that while not everything might go, although I predict that the same people will still stockpile, it will just make more money for the supermarkets. Everything will still go. But even if there's some stuff left, it's now so expensive that some people can't afford it.
The stockpiling wouldn't have spread because there wouldn't be a just reason to do so, because there'd still be some on the shelves.
Yeah, but you might not be able to afford what's still on the shelves, is my point. Because if you want, you underestimate the ability of people with money to spend stupid amounts to buy things they don't need if they think they do. So I think the toilet paper still would have gone. If they'd been charging £10 a pack for toilet paper, I think it still would have gone. I think your well-off middle-class family still would have bought everything and left the shelves empty. It just would have made the supermarkets 3-4 times as much money. And
I do underestimate people with more money than sense.
Yeah, and if there was some left, then you have someone who's just picked up their pension that goes to the supermarket.
Goes, why is
this bog roll 20 quid now? I can't pay for that. Or has to choose between that and food. Well, that's not acceptable. It's very simple. You just do what they did with hand sanitizer. At first, they put hand sanitizer on a purchase per person limit of two small bottles or one large bottle. And I note the shelves were still empty.
Yes.
That means that everyone that needed one, or generally speaking, everyone that needed one, got one. And no one got overcharged. Much more sensible way of doing it.
Well, it's not a bad way of putting the purchase limits. Like, I'm not disagreeing purchase limits were a bad thing.
Hiking prices due to immediate demand is, for large retailers, somewhat illegal.
You just had people bulk buying all of it and then flogging it on Amazon for high price.
Well, they tried in America. That guy that bought 70,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, and then Amazon immediately, because it was so public that he'd done it, Amazon banned him from being able to sell them. And I'm pretty sure that what actually happened was the authorities came around and took them all off him without reparation, because they were like, "We need this."
There were a lot on a smaller scale on eBay.
Yeah, on a smaller scale on eBay. Yeah.
Yes.
I did think the government seizing them under the under emergency powers in order to redistribute them was quite amusing. It's like, so how did that plan work out?
You can see the same thing happening when when Aldi will just sort of have some weird product that they'll just go, you know what, we will sell dirt cheap a jacuzzi this summer or a kayak.
No, not personally. I'm not.
Okay. Well, quite often, almost every year, Aldi will sell some typically expensive product that's quite large, that for a unreasonably low price is probably the best way of putting it. Like a few years ago, they were selling jacuzzis for like tens of quid. Like you could get a 40 quid jacuzzi.
Nice.
This year it was a 40 quid kayak that were the regular retail price in most places was 120 quid or so. And then people, within like 2 hours, they sold out all their stock, and then you were seeing them popping up on eBay and Amazon.
Well, okay. On a
do not underestimate the ability of people to just go, that's cheaper than normal, I will buy it and make an e-business.
On a slightly aerospace related note, there was a Lego set that officially came out yesterday, and 10 days before its official release, they cancelled it after some outcry from a German peace organization that it was a military set with against Lego's values, and it had it was actually branded. It was a
Technic model of the Osprey, so it was actually branded as Bell Boeing V-22 Osprey, even though they put it in a fictional rescue color scheme to try and make out that it wasn't a military aircraft. You couldn't really get around the fact that it still said Bell Boeing officially licensed on the box, and was therefore money was going to defense companies, and it was a model of a plane that is only used for military reasons. There is no civilian version in the world. So they cancelled it. But a very small number of these did get out. Some got out to reviewers by accident. A couple of stores actually had them delivered early. And that meant that
quid on eBay.
So you've gone and looked, have you? Some went for 2,000. What happened was the limited number that got out to the public, Lego said the stores were allowed to sell. They weren't going to ask them to be returned. If you already had them, you could sell them. And stores not being allowed to raise the prices sold them at normal market value. So they were selling for about 125 quid. And then some people bought in bulk. A bunch got out in New Zealand, and one guy bought about 10 of them. So, you spent about, in New Zealand dollars, you probably spent about 3,000 New Zealand dollars. And then which is about, and then you like half that for US dollars. And then these things were appearing on eBay there were bidding wars going on, and they went up to about 2,000 US dollars plus shipping. And the shipping was like $100 per. So this guy was making thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Again, similar concept. Although unlike a typical Audi bargain jacuzzi, there's a little bit more of a collector's value thing going on for the price.
Yes.
Lego sets.
Not exactly getting
this is the rarest of things. It's a Lego war set and a cancelled one too.
Yes.
So like there is a definite collector's value going there of something rare and probably never going to be seen again, and extreme exclusivity.
Lego won't make war sets, but they'll happily make Lego military sets.
Oh, I won't get into the hypocrisy here because
and the amount of
the hypocrisy is not worth delving into. It's been discussed at great length.
Do Lego City cops have guns?
No, they don't.
Oh, okay.
The hypocrisy amongst the current political climate regarding police that Lego has done police sets for a long time.
Jack Stone cops have guns. I think they did. Or do, yeah.
Lego's done Indiana Jones sets with literal Nazi soldiers in historically accurate German World War II vehicles. Like
wouldn't you?
Some of like the trucks and staff cars, because
if you're
the actual movies featured German military equipment. So when they were trying to cover the movies in terms of the set, they ended up making German military equipment. So the point is you could buy literal German World War II Nazi era stuff as Lego sets. I think one of their arguments was that they said that they don't want a child to ever pick up a Lego set and recognize military equipment that may have affected them in a conflict zone in the real world. So I think by that policy, they're talking about modern stuff only.
Yes.
Although they've literally done sets that resembled Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters, which is the most ubiquitous attack helicopter in the world. And any child now who has lived through a conflict zone in the world has probably at some point seen an Mi-24 helicopter. Like,
those
a child that escaped Syria has probably seen an Mi-24, and yet they it's the double bubble cockpit Russian tank. Yeah.
They've also done one that looked quite a bit like Apaches. There's very little, almost matchbox Lego sets.
Yeah, like that. They've done a number of like fighter jet sets. They've done a couple that were basically exact F-35s, and some. I had one as a kid that was an F-14, very obviously an F-14, swing wing and everything. And the hypocrisy's always been there. I think that the fallout because of this set release is probably going to mean that they get called out a lot more for the hypocrisy in the future. So they might actually stop doing any sets now that are even remotely military related. They might say it was just because of the official licensing, and as such they might continue, but I think they'll get called out for it. So this might actually be the end of them releasing sets depicting fast jets and helicopters and various machines that resemble anything in military use. even if they're not branded and they're brightly coloured and they don't have any visible weapons on them. I think that might be the end for it, because now the media's just going to be more aware.
So, do you remember the Lego movie and that famous song from it?
The one that actually made it into the charts and annoyed me for a long time because I liked the movie, but I could not stand the song.
And how when they had Lego Technic was reasonably new, they made quite a big push to have Lego utilised in schools.
Yeah, I remember that.
And they had been sponsored for decades by Shell.
Oh yes, I remember this when the media called them out on
there was a very successful Greenpeace YouTube video campaign, and as well as other things that pointing out the hypocrisy. Well, trying to anyway. And the YouTube video at the moment, so it was released in 2014, 8.8 million views, and it's parody of Everything is Awesome.
Yeah, I remember it being quite effective, and Lego did pull the Shell sponsorship after that.
Yes.
It's kind of slightly ironic that plastics coming directly from fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry. Lego is itself a product of the fossil fuel industry. It just can't have a sponsorship by one inside its products.
But it did do the job, because shortly after they released the video, they stopped the sponsorship.
Oh, I remember as a token gesture, Lego started making all the plant pieces out of green plastic that was derived from biosources.
Because
maybe less than 1% of all their part production was now being made from a non-petroleum plastic, and I'm pretty sure even that stopped because it was a low-quality plastic.
Quite probably.
I'm pretty sure now I've noticed there's a trend now to not use that plastic anymore. The plant pieces are now made out of the same plastic as everything else.
Well, a lot of these bioplastics are crap.
Well, they started with a bad quality plastic for the plant parts, I remember. It was always like a slightly flexible, weird green plastic that was kind of grainier. And then they changed from that to the bioplastic, and then they've scrapped that entirely and gone back to the same glossy material that they make everything else out of. So presumably that token gesture didn't last very long.
Well, the whole point of these bioplastics is they degrade. The problem with these bioplastics is they
degrade. Yeah, maybe not suitable for a product that's kind of markets itself on durability and the fact that it lasts forever, which it does.
I just realised there's a Game of Thrones bit in the ad, because the ad's got soft music's playing, and then it's got oil slowly rising in a wind.
Yeah, I saw it a long time ago.
Anyway,
one of the most successful. Was it Greenpeace?
Yeah, it was Greenpeace.
One of the most successful things they've actually done in recent years.
I know.
Their record's really not amazing.
No, it really isn't. So, how do you think we can solve our procurement issue and our finances in this world of post-COVID? Well, not even post-COVID.
You're asking me how essentially I would conduct myself if put in the position that Dominic Cummings has found himself. Yes. If I was conducting a defence review. Well, I'm not privy
Make
to
sure the troops can actually have decent weapons handling.
I'm not privy to the same internal discussions and facility tools that he is in terms of our cybersecurity and some of the threats that we have identified at an international level or domestic level that I'm not aware of. So I can't comment on that end of things. I can only comment on the physical.
Talking about cyber stuff, stop letting the Chinese be involved with Hinkley Point.
I'd be quite fond of us not being so chummy with them over anything, to be honest.
That too. Don't let them build our trains. Just don't let the Chinese build any state-funded infrastructure.
But basically, cyber is definitely not my area. If we're talking
hard weaponry,
if we're talking physical acquisition and sustainment, first thing I would do is ensure that we have the right facilities in place. We need to be speaking to the Americans about their GPS satellite network. Like we're at Galileo with the EU.
Yes.
What are we doing? We got to be close with the Americans, surely. We already buy American weapons that rely on GPS. Now, notably, the only US weapons that require GPS that we have properly in service are Tomahawk and AIM-120D. The latest AMRAAM version has mid-course correction from GPS, and that is what we bought to go with our F-35s until we get Meteor. Meteor, which is a European weapon, which has the same thing from Galileo, which we're no longer part of. So, interesting. I'll be interested to see how the GPS thing works out. But yeah, first I get us on the
if our missiles use Galileo.
I'm not sure if our missiles do use it. I'll have to check, or whether or not we can use the American satellites from now on. But the point is, we need a stable GPS network that's military secure GPS for our weapons. That's the first thing that I'd be getting sorted right now, because that's a discussion-based thing. We're not going to be starting a space program and launching our own system.
So, especially as we don't have our own launch.
It's very much a case of we need to be speaking right now about getting ourselves onto a stable military secure GPS network.
Yes. Well, especially as people keep mentioning, the UK government's just acquired OneWeb.
But that's not GPS.
That's
not GPS capable.
It is not. And it's not even manufactured in the UK.
Next thing, British jobs is good and important, definitely. But what has to be considered is that we've got ourselves into, in many ways, a monopoly, whereby there is only usually one major favoured contractor in almost any program that the UK requires militarily. And right now, that always seems to be BAE Systems.
Because of one signed with Babcock.
The previous pressures of the government to force British companies to form conglomerates reached its inevitable conclusion in that everything is now under BAE Systems. So we have a naval contract, they get it. We have a land systems contract, they get it. We have an air contract, they get it. Because
munitions contract, they get it.
Yes, mostly. So munitions is a bit of a different one. MBDA. But
MBDA don't make rifle rounds.
Yeah. Okay. So that is one major issue, is that BAE Systems has formed together pretty much the vast majority of all British military companies into one, and that if there's no competition, then as the actual the MOD's position is, they no longer have proper control over things like cost, timescale, and value for money, because they can't use a competition as a way to threaten or encourage, depending on your perspective, industry to do better.
Well, the MOD, they've already noticed that whenever they decide, right, British only, it's terrible. The costs are high, the quality is non-existent, it's slow.
It's also notable that this tends to only apply to programs that are just for us. If there's international involvement or there's export potential, you'll note that it does better. That may be for two reasons. Maybe it's because the international customers only are attracted to good designs, or maybe it's because there's more pressure to do well if there's potential to sell it to other people. I can't say specifically, but we can all agree that a monopoly in the industry is not a good thing. It doesn't help at all. And we can't re-split BAE up. We can't literally force them apart and create more companies. But one interesting thing is just being more open to foreign proposals. One great thing is that we modify foreign design, so British industry still gets they get to sink their teeth into it and get some jobs out there.
but we're also open to purchasing foreign design. So a great example of this is the helicopters we buy. The AH-64 Apache and the CH-47, sorry, Chinook. They're both American designs. And then Augusta Westland, gets to modify them. So we still have British jobs working on them. In fact, we license build them in the UK, the Apaches. But
I think
the design is not British.
Is we open the tendering up to all foreign countries, well, all foreign firms
Just
anyway, and small ones, but make have a system where the runners up or anyone is, as part of the contract in the procurement, gains. You agree that the runners up and whoever else can purchase it on license.
Or at least to have an involvement in it. Like this is what the US does with fighter programs, or any kind of programs. That usually the losing team in a design fly-off has a participation in the final project. They have industrial incentive. So it's the incentive that even if you lose, you still get something because you've done a lot of good work towards it.
Slice of the pie just to keep your firm alive.
Yeah.
Putting the effort into designing something's expensive.
But what they can do, the BA systems, you don't want to break it up. But one interesting thing in terms of bringing foreign offerings into our design competitions is allowing them to purchase stakes in BAE systems. So, for example, BAE Systems Land Division, which is quite a small part of their overall operation, had a 55% stake bought out by German company Rheinmetall last year. And the result of this was that the Germans' significant land vehicle design expertise was brought into a British company, and they could then finally start offering the MOD their vehicles and their technology without fear of being either ignored or just or shut out because they're not British. And this is partially a media issue, and it's because there is unfortunately a connection between foreign offerings to the British military and the British tabloid press being very critical of why they're not buying British. Funnily enough, they'll also be extra critical if the British stuff doesn't work. But double standards aside, even if there are far better offerings from another country, there's still almost like a public relations issue going on where they feel they have to go with the British option, because if they go with the foreign option, it will look really bad, like they're neglecting our own industry. Even though we're perfectly happy to neglect our industry by ourselves.
Shipbuilding industry.
Yeah. More acutely, it's tanks. It used to be Vickers Defence and Royal Ordnance, right? And during the Thatcher era, there was a policy of best of British, whereby foreign offerings, even if they were better, were to be discarded in design competitions. Back when we did actually allow the foreign offerings seriously into design competition. And basically what happened was that the British designs were always chosen, even if they were not correct or they weren't suitable. But when we went with Challenger 2, that was Vickers Defence and some of the parts by Royal Ordnance, and it could be the gun. But the companies and the contractors that built that tank for us throughout the 90s no longer exist. Not only was it the wrong vehicle, but we actively killed the ability to build it and maintain it by producing spare parts. We don't build the gun barrels anymore. Royal Ordnance just doesn't exist. It's part of BAE Systems, sure, officially, but they're not producing anything anymore. The facilities are gone. There is no factory in the UK currently producing rifled gun barrels for these tanks. And bear in mind, these wear out and fast. 600 rounds, and you've worn out those barrels, compared with 5,000 on the any other NATO tank. So not only do our barrels last considerably less time than everyone else's, but we don't even produce the spares because the company's gone. We don't produce the ammunition anymore. We actually had to start getting the Germans. We had to get a German firm to make British standard ammunition for us because we ran out and we didn't have a company making it anymore. Vickers Defence doesn't exist anymore in its old factories. The vehicle production facilities for Challenger 2, for the running gear, the suspension, the tracks, whatever, doesn't exist. And if you know one thing about tank tracks, it's that they wear out really quickly. and you have to do a lot of maintenance on them. So we don't have any parts. So we have to cannibalize vehicles to replace the parts. So this whole idea of we have to look like we're helping British industry out by not buying foreign, it's really dumb because we don't have a great track record of protecting British industry as it is, which comes back to bite us when we realise that we don't have the industrial capacity to do things that we used to.
So does Vickers go bust, or do they get bought?
No, they just got conglomerated, and I'm pretty sure the facilities that built. I'm pretty sure the facilities got moved over to making lighter vehicles.
Yeah.
I can't remember what we ended up building in the Challenger 2 factories, but it's certainly not tanks anymore. But now we've brought other countries into the mix. Germany is able to offer a lot of things. And this shouldn't just be specifically Germany. We should be more open to letting the Americans take out like stakes and present technologies. And the French, the French are not necessarily the easiest to work with, but they make some good stuff. Like the Germans, in less than a year of the Germans having the majority shareholding in BAE Land Systems, what they have done is they've already presented a new turret design with new electronic systems, a new gun, new fire control, new ammunition stowage for the Challenger 2. And they had this design in advance. They've been waiting for the opportunity to offer it. So they've had this design ready for Challenger 2. Not even a German tank, British tank, but a German company had already designed for it. That's because it was necessary. And now they've gone and used our tanks. They've used the Challenger 2 in the last few days as a test bed for their new gun, their huge 130mm smoothbore. So you can tell the Germans want to work with us. They want to work with our tanks. They want to offer us these upgrades. And heck, they offered us full tanks. A few years ago, they offered us 200 Leopard 2s that they would upgrade for about £2.5 million per tank, purchase plus upgrade in the price. And they'd upgrade it to the latest standard, the A7V standard. And we said no, because it would look bad to purchase German tanks. So instead of buying a German tank straight up for £2.5 million, we've now basically got a situation where instead of us buying a German tank, we have now got a German company buying the British company in order to change our tanks to be 60 to 70% German with only a little bit of the original British left, so that we can still call it a British tank so the tabloids don't get upset. Does that seem entirely sensible? Well, seems like an expensive and convoluted workaround to me, but, as long as we get the upgrades at the end of the day. As long as we get the upgrades.
Making the upgrades on the Warrior turret.
Interestingly enough, we got the Warrior turret changes, and then all of a sudden now we're also buying infantry carrying specific versions of the Ajax. This is an American chassis.
Yeah, I
think that Warrior's days might be slightly numbered if we're investing in that family.
Ajax, I'm not confident.
What about it specifically?
Well,
I have low confidence in the reconnaissance side because it's too big.
Yes.
I don't have much of an issue with the fighting vehicle side of it.
Oh yeah, but why? That was something we were good at. Recce vehicles, and our recce vehicle was good.
Well, yeah. If you're on a pure scout, you can't really do much better than the Scorpion and Scimitar family.
They're tiny. They weigh next to nothing. So famously, you'd have a tank driver drive over to a marsh.
You could literally carry them by Chinook. There's pretty much no other turreted tracked vehicle in the world, with the exception of the German Wiesel, which is a tiny little 4-ton midget thing. That, with the exception of the Wiesel, I can't think of any other tracked and turreted fighting vehicle. I wouldn't say tank because it's not a tank really, that could be transported by a single helicopter. It just doesn't exist. So that was a really, really cool capability that we had going on with those.
I mean, the fact that the weight on the treads was less than a person, like the ground pressure.
The ground pressure
is less than a person standing there. So famously, you could have tanks driving over a mild marsh, not realizing it's marshy. The tank crew jump out, and end up being knee deep in mud and go, "Oops."
Yeah, I don't know why we got rid of that family. They're good vehicles. But I suppose maybe the role of the battle, maybe when they say reconnaissance, they don't really mean it in the same way they used to, because the role of battlefield reconnaissance from the ground is very rapidly diminishing. Very rapidly diminishing.
With the rise of drones, it's less required.
Yeah, I'm going to say, like, these days you can just, as a squad, pull a little drone out of someone's back pocket, throw it into the air and get real-time information. And by extension, a vehicle can do that as well.
It's a bit harder to jam a tank, though.
Yeah, that's true.
Jam,
the enemy has
jam
to
his
know
radio.
jam it.
Yeah, he can jam his radio, but he's still there.
Yeah,
this is send a runner.
This is one thing that I have pointed out to people that have been telling me for a long time, that tanks are obsolete and we're never going to see tank battles again, so we shouldn't be investing in them. So, okay, so we take all our tanks away because you said they're obsolete, because in your words, someone with a much cheaper missile or rocket launcher can destroy the tank. So you take them away because you say they're obsolete. And then our troops run into a tank. So what do you do? What are you doing when you're staring down a 125 millimeter smoothbore gun, and you
call in air support, artillery support?
You call in air support, and they say we're going to be there in 2 minutes, and the tank's like, yeah, I can fire 12 rounds at you in that time, easily, probably
pull
more.
Out a javelin that someone's been lugging for the last however many hours.
You pull out a javelin, fine, okay. You fire your javelin at the tank, and while you're getting this javelin sorted, the tank is probably hosing your position with a machine gun. And you fire off your javelin, and they see the javelin coming out, and the puff of smoke or dust that it kicks up on launch. And then the second you fire that, you've now got a 125 millimeter shell through your face because you've given away your position. And if you survive firing it and you guide it to the target, little few things on modern tanks that we're going to be seeing increasingly. Something not quite so modern, but the modern versions of it are very, very effective. Explosive reactive armor. Some versions of that now, double layered, can even restrict the penetration of tank shells, but against missiles, they're really effective. You can have double layered, triple layered ERA blocks, which will be very resilient to missiles. So even though your javelin comes in and hits the top of the tank, that ERA might stop it. And that's assuming that the tank doesn't intercept it with either a passive defense system, like the Russians have got a number of systems that are designed to scramble the sensors on incoming missiles, not say jam them, but overwhelm them so that they miss, or the tank doesn't have a laser warning receiver system that tells the tank crew they're being targeted and from which direction. So the moment before you even fired the missile, the tank knows where you are and has swung that gun around and it kills you. Or an active protection system. So you're actively firing a countermeasure into the air by radar guidance, and the countermeasure blasts out and blows up the incoming missile before it even makes contact with the tank. All those things on that tank, and now your guys on the ground are staring down the barrel of a tank, and their man-portable ways of dealing with it have failed. So in that situation, what do you do? Hope the air support gets there really fast is what you hope for.
You go for the Estonian method and run for the trees.
Tanks got thermals, and trees don't stop tank shells. So it's a problem, which is why even though the bean counters haven't wanted to admit it while they've done nothing to upgrade our tank force for the last 20 years, they don't want to, heck, in Britain's case, 30 years. The bean counters haven't wanted to admit it, but the tank has never been obsolete.
But Bradley,
the only reason there's been no incentive for us to upgrade our tanks has been because Russia has not been in a financial position to upgrade theirs
until recently.
Bear in mind, most of the stuff I just talked about, the Russians had prototype versions in the 90s. The big scary T-14 Armata they have in limited numbers now. They essentially had a bigger, badder version of that in the 1990s. Bigger gun, active defense system, even thicker armor. They didn't see production because it was too expensive and the Soviet Union fell apart. But the point is, this isn't new stuff. We've known about this for quite a while. So when like analysts and bean counters say we don't need tanks, don't need to upgrade tanks, it's purely been because there wasn't a perceived enemy threat. It wasn't because the technology was obsolete. It was because they figured that they could get away with putting it off another 10 years. And they did that 3 or 4 times until they eventually accepted that, okay, we're a bit behind now. Which is why everyone's rushing to come up with new ground vehicles. Why we're adopting so many new types. Because, well, we neglected it. We completely neglected the capability. Which is... I'm not a seer. I can't tell exactly what's going to come out of the Defence Review in September, but I would expect that ground force, especially armour, is going to be one of the biggest areas that's going to get shaken up. Because
I think what we need is
the UK has a complete contradiction in our ground forces. We're never going to fight a ground war in the UK ever. Likelihood is that what we predicted was going to be during the Cold War years, we had large permanently stationed armored forces in Europe, but we don't have that now. We have small state forces stationed there, but mostly we'd be aiming for a conflict in Europe that we'd have to move stuff there. We need rapid deployability, and anywhere else in the world, you're not going to be seeing these climactic, huge vehicle-on-vehicle battles, which require as heavy and powerful a vehicle as what was designed in the 70s, which is what most countries are using in their armies still today, because they haven't changed them. So what the British really need is more types of lighter, more easily deployable vehicles that are more flexible. We can get them. We can stick instead of like we can stick one tank in a C-17, it should be we can stick 3 of these fighting vehicles, of whichever form they might become, in a C-17 and take them wherever they need to go quickly. That needs to be closer to being the case in the future. There needs to be a greater focus on what you can move around to get where it needs to be. And when it gets there, it needs to maybe have less of a focus on physical, heavy, passive armor protection, more of a increased focus on these lighter technologies like active protection systems, laser warning receiver systems, jamming and countermeasures, and ERA, which doesn't really weigh very much. And I feel like NATO countries have often neglected the development of explosive reactive armor. That's always seemed to have been a Russian thing, and we've gone for the big, heavy, passive armor approach. But I think we're getting to the point now where you can say the heavy passive armor is getting to the end of its useful life, because it's just too restrictive on the ability to move these things around. And then also we need to be seeing step change.
Well, it can also be so easily penetrated.
Well, yeah, like that's the deal, isn't it? Right. The idea of passive armor versus explosive reactive armor is that ERA, it works once, whereas passive armor can work after multiple hits. But the issue with modern vehicles is that you can't armor them everywhere. Even on the front, you can't armor them everywhere because composite armor is very space reliant. You need a lot of room to fit composite armor sections in the chassis, which means there are some areas where the geometry of the vehicle doesn't allow you to armor it properly. So there's gaps in the armor that can still be hit. And the other thing is that firepower is way more often above protection throughout history. With the exception of some very large and impractical vehicles like the Tiger and Tiger II, in World War II, most of the time, any tank could destroy any tank with its gun.
Well, it's like the Russian tank requirement, I think, for the armor in World War II was it had to be able to withstand a frontal hit from its own gun from a kilometer away.
I can see that being the case for the Russian guns. Their performance was not spectacular, like the T-30. The T-30
design of T-34 and KV-1 and things.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. But historically speaking, armor has always been inferior to firepower. There have been very few times where you could say armor was doing better. Bless me. And right now, we're definitely looking at a period where the firepower is above the armor. Because to have enough armor to stop the latest ammunition would just restrict your mobility. That's me again.
I was just going to say, ask the Knights at Agincourt.
The ability to actually protect against the current levels of firepower with passive armor would just restrict your weight and mobility so much to be beyond any use.
So, on the topic of mobile forces, of stick your armored vehicles into a cargo aircraft of some shape or form and fly it to your destination, drive out, and you go, haha, we have armored vehicle, what are you going to do? What we should do is buy the 747. Because even a C-17 only has a payload of 170 odd thousand pounds.
Get around to an issue here.
747's 250 odd.
Yeah, you're going to run into a slight issue with this one.
What?
It's that the 747s are not wide enough. They're not designed for the same load dimensions.
Yeah, that's true.
The other thing is that tanks put an incredible point loading on an airframe. Cargo 747, you're more likely to be spreading the weight out amongst the hold, whereas in the case of transporting large military vehicles, all of that weight, which is quite substantial when you consider that a main battle tank is about 60 to 70 tons.
Yes,
it's all going onto one part of the floor. I don't think you could comfortably use a 747 for that.
Well, either way, we need lots more effective large
airlifters,
container aircraft.
Admittedly, our C-17 fleet is not the biggest, but you could argue that the UK's requirements are more modest than the Americans.
True, but I would want to be able to deploy an entire tank company at a moment's notice.
Well,
I'm saying a bare minimum company. Yeah, but a ship.
We do that by ship mostly because Challenger 2 is too heavy. Challenger 2 is too heavy for the C-17 Globemaster.
If I was the defence minister, picking what happens, I would want a tank company that we can deploy by air with 24 hours notice.
I would say you're going to need a very new type of tank for that.
Well, the Challenger 2 is showing its age.
I would very much like us to have a new type of tank. I think the Challenger 2 life extension program to take it to 2035, if we go with the German proposal, it will get to that date. Yes. I think that the RBSL Rheinmetall BAE Systems land proposal for Challenger 2 life extension program will take the vehicle to that date before it leaves service, comfortably enough. But is it a wise use of money? No, it's not a wise use of money because such a heavy vehicle as the Challenger 2, which was designed for large European tank-on-tank conflict, its days are gone. It's not the tank we need now, so upgrading it was probably a mistake. Upgrading it at the cost it's going to be, probably, still a mistake. But we don't really have much choice because we delayed so long. If we were going to change vehicle, we should have done it 10 years ago. And there is no new vehicle available in industry to replace it. There is no lighter, more modern alternative. We have to design and build one, which takes 10 years.
Or those people saying tanks are useless really should be saying our tanks are useless.
Well, pretty much everyone in NATO, with the exception of the French, is using a tank that is in the 70-ton range. They are, by the end of this decade, they're reaching the end of their life, which is why everyone's looking to design new tanks. The Americans are looking to design a new tank. The French and the Germans are looking to design a new tank. This is something I'd like to see in the defense review, is that we acknowledge that we can probably get 10 more years of good usefulness out of the type of tanks we currently have and fighting vehicles in general that we currently have. But after that 10 years, their niche will become like the A-10 Warthog, that their war will be gone. They might still have some battlefield use, but it will be expensive and difficult to get that battlefield use out of them. I don't think a large gun on a very well armored platform is ever going to be obsolete. That is to say that I don't think that an upgraded Challenger 2 is going to be useless after 10 years. It will probably just end up being more heavy and expensive to use than an alternative after 10 years. So like there'll be something better. That isn't to say it will be useless. But so 2035, I can see them hanging on to 2035. We absolutely need to start on a program now to have something, probably not one thing, but probably many things to be the replacement by that date. And I say probably many things because if you're going for lighter vehicles, they can't do all the same things. Let's say you want, if you're going to save weight somewhere, there has to be compromises. One vehicle can't do it all in that situation. You can't have that battlefield juggernaut that takes all the hits and is loaded with machine guns for dealing with infantry and can also slug it out with other tanks at 3-4 kilometers range. You can't have all of that in one platform if you're looking to lighten by 20 or 30 tons, which we should be trying to do. But absolutely, we should be capping the design at 40 tons for all future vehicles. But that's not possible to have it all in one system. So most countries that right now, especially the German-French program, they're looking to have multiple different versions on a family of vehicles with different turrets and different weapons options. Some with missile carriage, some with big guns, some with small guns, some unmanned versions, some manned versions. And that's going to take time to develop. The system is quite good. We've seen from the Boxer infantry fighting vehicles that this modular architecture is actually a pretty good idea. But it's never been turned into a proper fighting vehicle, an armored fighting vehicle on the scale that they're looking at now. So there's going to have to be a lot of testing involved, and it takes time to develop this stuff. We got 15 years. By the date we've set for out of service for Challenger 2, we have 15 years. That's a lot of capability to make up in that time.
Yes. I mean, an undergrad takes 3 years.
And yeah, most of all, I want to see a bit more creativity going on in the design department about the actual kind of conflicts we can expect. But I would say if there's one thing that one thing of the old generation of tank design, the old school of thought, we can't sacrifice its firepower. You can take away the armor, you can take away the size and the versatility. But if you take away the firepower, then when you come up against something with all that armor protection, you're in trouble. So what you have to do, basically, firepower should inform armor. If the firepower levels are too strong, then armor becomes slightly irrelevant and you can tone back the armor. But if your firepower levels become too weak, then suddenly armor becomes vital again and your opponents can get the upper hand. So yes, absolutely, the firepower should not be sacrificed. In fact, we should be looking for a marked increase in firepower. Either a bigger gun or more advanced gun design.
Armor should only be sufficient to require significant investment in firepower.
Sort of. I think we're at a generational period right now when the material technology is just not there to make a stronger but lighter armor beyond what we've already got. So,
well, the last thing you want is some tank that can be penetrated with small arms.
Yeah, exactly. I would say as long as your armor is good against all commonly faced man-portable systems, it's good enough. So, and bear in mind, you don't actually need as much armor as you'd think to stop man-portable systems, because man-portable systems are a lot more susceptible to active protection systems, countermeasures, and ERA. So you don't need as much heavy armor to stop a man-portable weapon like a javelin or a TOW.
I mean, for one thing, you're limited how big, how fast it travels, how big the warhead for man-portable, because a man has to port it.
And chemical warheads are very susceptible to ERA and countermeasures. And I don't know of any man-portable kinetic kill weapons for use against tanks, because you just can't get the velocity or the firepower. A recoilless rifle, I guess, but recoilless rifles are 1950s tech, so you're not going to...
Even the Piat wasn't a kinetic weapon.
Whoa, yeah, the spring-powered anti-tank weapon of the 1940s was
Definitely not kinetic. I mean, it would have been kinetic if it hit you on the head.
Yeah.
But definitely not kinetic in terms of its effect on vehicles. But yeah, essentially, you don't actually need to use as much weight to make yourself resistant to chemical warheads and man-portable systems. So, for example, there are active protection systems that have been designed to protect Humvees. You know, an 8-ton Humvee can be protected from rocket-propelled grenades and missiles by an active protection system. As long as you have the weight allowance for the radars and the launchers, that's it. Doesn't weigh very much.
Things being launched,
but the protection levels it offers is amazing. Now,
yes.
will that stop a tank shell, a discarding Sabo tank round? No, it will intercept them. I've seen video evidence that from multiple country systems, including Ukraine's and Germany's, and Russia claims it as well, and so does the British system. That they can actually intercept Sabo rounds. Now they can destabilize them. They can destabilize them, and they can reduce their penetrative power, but they're not going to stop it. No. So if your vehicle has got almost no passive armor at all, so like a Humvee, is very, very lightly armored, your active defense system is not going to stop a tank shell. But I don't think you should have to. I think there's a lot more flexibility to offer on the battlefield by a lighter vehicle that gives up the majority of the passive protection in favor of the active systems. As long as you can stop small arms, like you said, and as long as you can stop man-portable systems, you have already solved the protection issue for 90% of the threats you are going to encounter.
Well, let's just make a play on an old army phrase. It's better to be on hand with 10 tons than absent with 100.
Yeah, I can believe that. And then the other thing to consider is, sure, you protected yourself from 90% of threats you're going to face. So now what happens when you come up against something that is firing a tank shell, a big discarding Sabo round? Well,
you fire back.
You get them first. That's the first thing. You kill them first, which was pretty much the German approach with the Leopard 1 design in the 60s, was that if you focused entirely on firepower, mobility, and gun control, then you didn't need armor. Because at the time, there was no composite armor back then. Firepower was overwhelmingly beating out protection in the 1960s. And they figured that meant if you focused on everything else, you would have a better chance of surviving than if you tried to have armor that wasn't enough, which is what the Americans and Russians and British were doing. Armor, but not enough to stop anything. So the Germans put almost no armor on the Leopard, and, well, it was never battlefield tested. And then composite armor spelled the end, and they went to Leopard 2. But it definitely was a correct design at the time. And I think we're in a similar position now, and I don't see any advance on the horizon that's going to change matters regarding passive armor. I just think the firepower is just too strong. And there's upgrades. There are upgrades to firepower in the works right now that will negate any increase in armor that we'll see in a generation. ETC cannons, electrothermal chemical ignition, already producing substantial muzzle velocity and muzzle energy increases for the same sized round and the same gun. So that's already a step up. For every gun, we can get an upgrade using ETC propellants and new barrel designs without increasing the size of the gun or the weight on the vehicle. Like that's already made any armor improvement we might see in the next 10 years pointless, because just go, okay, we'll go to ETC guns then. And the ETC guns will make the new armor pointless. We know we can stop guided rounds, missiles, man-portable stuff. We know we can stop that. So when we run into these things we can't stop, large kinetic rounds, you either get them first or you die, which is why for Western militaries who are a little bit less tolerant of loss of human life than some other countries might be, that's where the majority of these new vehicle designs, they're seemingly optionally manned. Even the Russians have already gone in this direction. The Russians are being surprisingly Western with the Armata. The Armata is designed to be optionally manned. Well, supposedly, within a short distance, a few miles, there is an ability to do an on-the-ground secure data link to the T-14, and the crew can drive the tank remotely.
And the Armata is not a badly protected vehicle. I might add, the hull of the Armata, where the crew sits in their capsule, has got estimated protection values better than anything else in the world.
I mean, the fact that you describe it as having a capsule just says it all.
Yeah, it has a separate capsule for the crew. The turret's unmanned, and the whole capsule is the best armored of any vehicle in the world. So currently in service, at least. And yet they still figured they might want to put an optionally manned capability on there. This is the future. It is the direction things are going to be going. There are some threats you will never be able to protect against, and I think firepower is just going to be at that point where you just go, okay, there's no stopping that. And so in cases where you can't guarantee anything close to safety for the crew, the very valuable, well-trained Western military crew, you take them out of the vehicle. If it's a situation where a significant likelihood of death, you take them out of there. That's the era we're moving into. It's the way air combat is going. Air combat is going towards optionally manned with the next generation. Tempest is designed as optionally manned. The European project, the Franco-German FCAS Future Combat Air System program, that's optionally manned. Very much the direction that things are going right now is that you can add in all sorts of protection measures that are not passive and physical. So not armor. I'm talking things like stealth, jamming, electronic countermeasures, active protection systems, passive protection systems, whatever. For ground and air, you can put all of those in place, but eventually there will come a situation where you can't stop something hitting you. And if you can see that you can't stop something hitting you, well, then you take the human out and you allow that thing to hit you. As long as you can do your job before it does, then that's served its purpose.
The second or third lesson in fencing: if you're not competent at parrying, step away. If you're not there, they can't hit you.
Yeah, pretty much. In this case, it's if they're going to hit you, don't be there.
Well, yes, if you're not competent at blocking the blow, don't be there.
Because equipment loss is expensive, but is not as timely to deal with as personnel loss.
No.
It's
saying that, how long does it take to build an F-35?
Start to finish? That's hard to say because
they're rolling off the production line.
Yeah, they are rolling off the production line. I don't know also with the supply chain how long particular parts take. It might only take an aircraft a few months, like 3 months, to go from one end of the production line to the other. But how long does each individual part take? There might be some parts that take longer than the whole aircraft, but they're coming from a supply chain somewhere else. So I don't actually know that figure, but less than a year, I would say.
Yes, so definitely less training than the tank crew.
Less training than the pilot.
Well, how long, do you think tanks are harder to build or longer than aircraft? Certainly more tonnage to assemble.
For the UK right now, yeah, they're harder because we don't have the industry. We let it go. But for a country that has maintained it, very, very easy. The steel part, easy enough. Tank production does not take as long as aircraft production. The Americans basically have kept their Abrams factory going just to stop it from being shut off, essentially. Because if they shut it off and have to restart it, it would cost a fortune, and they'd lose all the expertise in building tanks. So America has been building Abrams tanks they don't even need, shipping them straight out the door and putting them in a scrapyard. Like that's pretty much how easy it is to build tanks once you've got the facilities going.
Why don't we just acquire a few spares?
It'd be more hassle than it's worth at this point to take non-standard for British equipment that heavy, bring it all the way over the Atlantic, and then train people to use it when it's not
Abrams is heavy, isn't it?
It's the same as Challenger 2, pretty much. They're both on the very heavy end of the spectrum. Challenger 2 with theatre entry standard TES is 75 tons. Abrams is about 75 tons when you include Tusk, which is the equivalent of theatre entry standard. Challenger 2 is they're both too heavy. They are both too heavy. The difference is that Tusk is an upgrade package whereas TES stands for Theatre Entry Standard. So basically, in order for the Challenger 2 to meet the protection levels that it's supposed to have as a default for war, it ends up weighing as much as an Abrams does when you've put on the Urban Survival Kit. TUSK literally means Tank Urban Survival Kit. So, yeah, I can't speak for what went wrong in the Challenger 2 design program for it to end up weighing quite as much as it did while offering the protection levels it does. But I think hindsight being 2020, it's not even hindsight. There were engineers saying at the time that Challenger 2 was wrong, but it is what it is. It should have been handled differently. But hey, we can't change that now. All we can do is wait for the reviews to come out in September and hope that we have a slightly more well-directioned program. I'm sure when they started designing Challenger 2 that it seemed like when the initial design studies in the 80s, it seemed like particularly relevant to design it in the way that they did. But by the time it actually entered service, no. The need was long gone for the type of design that in that way.
Yeah, we certainly need a lot more cheaper programs that we're less attached to, so that if the need disappears or changes, we can go, let's take this elsewhere.
I suppose that's one advantage of the modular approach, is that the only bit that you really have to not screw up is how you design the running gear, the chassis, the suspension, the powertrain. Basically, get the system architecture right the first time round. But then all the other stuff, the optional armor packs, the optional turrets and mission kits, you can be pretty risky with that stuff and try new stuff out without too much in the way of risk, because the whole system is not, you don't, instead of don't design the whole thing around a particular weapon system, because if that goes wrong, then that's a problem. Like, look at the Zomwalt class destroyers, the stealth destroyers, the American, but they only built 3 in the class. They wanted 30 something, and then it shrunk again and again and again. It shrunk to 7, and then it shrunk to 2, and then some senator wrangled another one out for more production for their state. Anyway, so they ended up with 3 of them. That ship was designed around a new gun system and new ammunition. It was designed around the BAE advanced gun system, which is the 155mm artillery in stealth turret.
Us flogging the Americans for once.
The gun works. The gun works completely fine. The ships are fitted with those guns, and they work. Here's the issue with them. They don't have any shells. That being because the whole reason of building a ship that was moving back to heavy gun armament for the first time in generations, the whole idea of moving away from that, it was a bigger ship than the Arleigh Burkes, but they reduced the number of missiles and increased the guns considerably. 1 5-inch gun to a pair of 6-inch guns. That's a pretty big step up. And they designed this around the concept that future ammunition types, rocket-assisted guided projectiles, and ultra-long-range projectiles that were originally designed for railguns would enable this new naval artillery to reach out very, very far, hit very hard, deliver more firepower than a missile could, in theory, and do so more cost-effectively, because the idea is that, well, a shell is cheaper than a missile. So this seemed really, really appealing.
It's a guided shell, because then it's a missile.
Yeah, like I said, this seemed really appealing, and they designed most of the ship around these guns. Slight issue. They actually deliver far less explosive punch than a missile would. In the case of the railgun projectiles, they deliver no explosive punch. It's purely kinetic. So that you have to fire far more to have the same effect that a single missile would. But at the extreme ranges that these new shells can reach, the rocket-powered shells and the railgun rounds, the huge ranges that you're firing at, like 60, 70 miles, they were talking a couple of 100 miles for the railguns. You can't hit anything unless you guide the shell. And guided shells are expensive, like you said, very. To hit a moving target like a ship at that range is incredibly difficult.
And the thing is, missiles can actively seek out and find a target after you've fired them. So if you know the rough position of a ship, the missile, advanced anti-shipping missiles will do the rest by themselves. You might not know the exact position, but the missile is not dumb. The missile will use long-range anti-shipping missile made by Lockheed. It passively detects enemy radar and finds the position of its target via their emissions, and it actually avoids radar detection. Once it knows what the target is, it picks a route that will avoid detection until the last moment. It's really, really smart. And yes, it's very expensive, but it's delivering a really big warhead. And B, it doesn't need to know exactly where the target is to hit it at very long range, because it can find it, it can hunt it down. Whereas a lot of naval combat is about knowing where the enemy is. It literally is a game of battleship still, in terms of finding where the enemy is to engage them properly. And these even guided artillery shells, you need to know really accurately where your target is, because otherwise the shell isn't going to be close enough to guide itself on. The shell can't detect the target. The shell is GPS guided. It knows where you want it to hit, and it will hit that spot. But if you don't know where the target is to a great degree of accuracy, you can't actually hit it.
Well, it's also, computers are a bit sensitive. They get banged around a bit. And going down a barrel of a big gun does put a lot of stress on a projector.
You have to be a bit more simplistic with the system so they can survive the several thousand Gs of the gun firing. Like I said, this is all well and good if you know where your target is, because then you can have a fairly simple system that just uses GPS to go, this is the spot you want me to hit. I will guide myself to that spot and hit it, accounting for wind conditions and stuff like that. But if your mission for that projectile is, we want to fire you at a target we only know the rough position of, and you must now find the target en route and guide yourself in to hit it. Now you have to have much more complicated systems on board that cannot be fired out of a gun without breaking them. Then it gets even worse, because you have to fire more of these because they're delivering less punch for each round than a missile would. You have two options. You either fire a lot more, accounting for misses and the lower explosive mass, or that projectile has to be able to target specific parts. I remember them advertising, doing promotional videos of the railguns as being able to mission kill enemy warships by taking out things like the radars and the missile silos. You're not going to be able to hit a ship at the range of these guns.
Yeah.
Let alone be able to target a specific part of it.
The thing I imagined railguns doing to ships is just sort of penetrating through the waterline.
But no, it wouldn't do enough. It wouldn't do enough. Compartmentalization of ships, that wouldn't be enough to significantly cripple it. The point is, you'd have to hit a ship multiple times with these things to do any meaningful amount of damage compared with what a single missile hit would do. And like we've already discussed, it's very hard to get these rounds to actually hit a moving ship that you might not know the exact position of at distance. So the Navy rapidly realized that the technology for these shells simply didn't exist. And where it did exist, it was prohibitively expensive. I think it reached the point where about 5 of these guided shells, the rocket-powered guided shells, 5 of them would cost as much as one of the missiles. But they would deliver that 5 shells, assuming they all hit, which they wouldn't, and at lower ranges than the missile would offer.
A significantly lower
would deliver far less explosive to the target. So the Navy just went, wait a minute, this is really dumb. There's no point in this. This is more expensive. This is less capable. This is why we stopped having large gun-armed ships in the first place, which led them to the state the Zumwalt class are now in, where they cancelled every projectile for the guns. So the most major weapon system that the ship has available to it has no teeth, and it never will, because I don't see there being any point for them to ever develop new ammunition for these guns, because the concept is hopelessly flawed. And if they
supposedly slightly stealthy.
Yeah, they're stealthy, but due to budget, they had to keep removing features of stealth. So the radar cross-section went from the size of a small rowing boat to now being the size of a substantial fishing boat.
Well, if you can sneak up on an enemy, You can knife.
That's not enough to sneak up on an enemy. It might help. It might help in a battle of radar detection of ships at sea at long range. It might help to hide more effectively. As like no stealth is invisible. Stealth is always supposed to give you an extra layer of advantage. But for all the compromises and cost increases that the stealth of the Zumwalt provided, it really hasn't turned out to be quite as stealthy a ship as you'd think. And pretty much all modern warships are designed with some form of stealth in mind. They're all designed with rather faceted and angled shapes of the superstructures and the hulls. Like the Type 45 destroyers were designed and advertised originally as stealth ships. They're not. They are about on par with any other modern warship in terms of reduced radar cross-section. But the point is, it hasn't severely affected their combat capability to make them in a more angled and faceted way.
Yeah, but we haven't tested anything against a near peer recently, have we?
Well, it's more the fact that we didn't overdo the stealth. We weren't like drastically changing the design in order to reduce the radar cross section like the Zumwalt has done. And due to cost, the Zumwalt has failed most of that.
Wasn't a stealthy floating object with some capability.
Yeah, basically. And even then, the Zumwalt is like partially stealthy. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, most navies. You look at most navies today. Even the Russians and the Chinese, they're designing ships with radar detection in mind. Heck, the Russians even designed the T-14R Martyr with a degree of radar cross-section reduction in mind.
What's a tank? Who uses radar against tanks? Some missiles.
Low-flying aircraft. Lots of increased, like F-35, for example, uses a mixture of the distributed aperture system, which is optical, and the radar, which is the ANAPG 88, I think, is the F-35's rate. It might be the 81. Either way, it's got a significant focus on ground scanning, which includes detection of equipment on the ground. It tells the DAS system where to look, essentially. The radar picks something up, and the DAS system focuses in on it and marks it. Optical systems, you always need to know where to look. You can't have both high resolution and large area sweep at the same time. It just won't work. So if you can make your tank a little bit more resistant to radar, that's a good thing. Helps you hide it with the ground clutter, makes it a little bit longer range or rather a little bit shorter range before the enemy radar picks you up as a target. So there's always an advantage. You're not claiming to be invisible. You're just trying to add a few extra kilometers into your advantage.
A few extra K, a few extra seconds, increase the chance that you see them first.
Exactly. That's the majority of what stealth is, unless you're going to the absolute extremes, which cost a lot of money. A lot of money.
Get shot down by Serbians.
With
Russian help.
Admittedly, they wouldn't have shot down an F-22, but the F-22 is also out there costing $200 million an aircraft, whereas the F-117, which was old technology by the time the Serbians shot one down, the F-117 was very, very primitive in terms of stealth technology. But again, it was trying to be purely invisible, which is a bit of a mistake.
And
trying to be invisible alone will not help you. Forever.
What was the prototype called that the Skunk Works were working on before it became the F-117?
Have Blue.
Which was unstable in all three axes.
Yep.
So they did what? They stuck like an F-16 flight computer per axis to control the plane?
Something like that, yeah. Because it was because they hadn't considered aerodynamic performance whatsoever when they were designing it. They literally chose the most
they considered
the most optimal
bit,
shape for stealth,
but not very much.
Yeah, they chose the optimized shape for the stealth aspect of the aircraft. The issue being that the design software at the time couldn't do curves.
Yes,
which is why
the priority was stealth and will it get airborne. And
the computer program wasn't able to do both stealth and curves, so that's why it ended up with completely straight lines everywhere, and therefore it was the most unaerodynamic, most unstable pig to fly even with the software, it was nicknamed the Wobbling Goblin because it was always it never wanted to stay in a straight line.
It still had more polygons than a Cybertruck.
That is true. I wonder what the radar cross-section is of a Cybertruck, despite being stainless steel. But they sacrificed absolutely everything for the stealth, and then, of course, there were some issues with trying to remain purely invisible, especially with the 1970s, 80s technology they built it with. And those issues did eventually get one shot down. And those issues were pretty stuff we've solved since. We solved pretty quickly since with generations of tech, like the
guidance cassettes, navigation.
Yeah, basically because it couldn't have any communication. They had no way of. At the time they couldn't get secure, non-traceable communication links. So that meant it didn't use GPS. It didn't. It was purely using internal navigation. They would give it cassette tapes that were programmed with the route to the target and the exact time and position to release the bombs. And the aircraft would do the entire flight using inertial navigation, astral tracking, whatever. The Blackbird used astral tracking. I'm not sure. Not F-117 did. It might have done. I have to check that. And it would do the whole pre-recorded flight, release its weapons, and then come back, essentially on autopilot. So what the first thing the Serbians noticed was the exact timing precision of when the bombs were going off. Then they knew what flight routes they were using, and they knew when they were going to be in a particular place. And this was only declassified recently. There was a decade of speculation about how the shootdown happened, and it was only fairly recently that they've actually admitted to things like how the F-117s were guided to their targets, which explained partially why the Serbians, with the Russians' help, because the Russians actually were very eager to shoot one of these down. They sent radar experts to help because they wanted to get the best chance of shooting down a Nighthawk, because they wanted to basically reverse engineer it and see what the technology was. Interestingly enough, because it was actually theirs, it was built using a Russian physics paper that they'd ignored.
Yes.
But they knew where they were going to be and at what time because of the pre-programmed flight routes. They also knew that when it opened the weapons bay doors to release weapons, they got a radar return. So they had a couple of seconds in which they could lock onto and hit it. Issue is, if they fired at it during those few seconds, the doors would shut, they'd lose the radar return, and the passive warning systems on board would tell the pilot they'd been engaged because they'd be lit up by the missile's radar and they'd know they were engaged. So what they did was they fired a string of missiles along the flight path with their radars disengaged. And at the moment they knew it was about to open the weapons bay doors, the moment they got a radar return, for the last few seconds, they turned on the radars on all the missiles and guided one of them hit the target in that few seconds window where they had a radar return. That wouldn't work with a modern stealth aircraft because you don't fly on a pre-programmed route anymore. You can do whatever the hell you want. At the same time, modern stealth aircraft would probably have already detected the launch site of the missile and done something about it. Alternatively, they're much more maneuverable. They're much faster. F-22 be coming in at Mach 2. It's got much better missile warning systems on board than the F-117 did, and they're not based on radar. It would actually detect the thermal signature of the missile launch, so you wouldn't actually be able to get that. You wouldn't be able to pull that trick anymore. And it would probably also be able to maneuver to avoid said missile. And it's not flying on pre-programmed routes at predictable times. So, very niche circumstances of that shoot down, but it did prove that just trying to be invisible was occasionally going to be a flawed concept.
Bless you.
It's been a pretty bad night for allergies.
Or as they say in Eastern Europe, nastrave.
On discussions about being invisible, I think I'm going to have to call
doesn't
that
work.
So it's been very nice talking.
Yes, it has been. Hopefully we'll have another session some point, maybe next week.
Pick some different topics.
You won't sneeze everything out.
Yep. Look to be a
goodbye.